Good evening, and welcome to tonight's webinar. So we're very pleased to be starting the 2021 series of the EDA webinars tonight with Linda Garton speaking about ladies' peels. We'll just go through a bit of housekeeping before we get going. It's only the cameras and microphones on my computer that will be active this evening. Please do feel to move around and enjoy yourself, and not worry that you'll be disturbing anyone. Please do ask any questions in the Q&A interface, which you'll find down at the bottom of the screen if you're on the app, either on your phone or on your computer. Just ask any questions that you want in there, and we'll get round to them at the end of the talk. Use the chat if you'd like to sort of provide any commentary, or if you've got any technical questions, I'll be monitoring that, and we'll try and get round to seeing if we can help you out or answer any questions or bring those in at the end. I think that's about it. Like I say, this starts off the 2021 sequence of webinars for the EDA. We'll be aiming to run them every fortnight. So we've got Tom Ridgman is going to be talking about horrible histories of bell ringing in 2 weeks' time. So we'll be looking forward to that. But for tonight, like I say, we are really pleased to welcome Linda to speak on ladies' peels. So I'm just going to ask her to appear on screen, and hopefully, as if by magic, here we go.
Oh, okay.
Good evening,
right,
Linda.
Hello. Right, let me just share my screen and fiddle around with slideshows.
Yeah.
There we go. Right. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see me and hear me. And right. Okay, so from hats to bikinis, that will become evident a little bit later. But just a quick introduction about why I have recently, well, got this interest in ladies' peels, I suppose. It really started, or I started researching ladies' peels in more detail quite recently as part of the Women in Ringing project, which Julia Cater was running. And I don't know whether I offered or had my arm twisted, I can't quite remember now, to write an article for the Ringing World as part of the Women in Ringing edition in November about ladies' peels. I suppose my interest, I've rung quite a lot of them. And also as a student, I used to ring quite regularly at Cubitt Town in London, where the first ladies' peel was rung. I'll be talking about that later, but I was always fascinated by a photograph of the band that sat in the tower and the peel board. As I say, we'll come on to that shortly. But first of all, to talk first of all about the very first attempt to ring a ladies' peels. The very first attempt was attempted at Cubitt Town in London, which is in London's Docklands, for those who aren't sure. And it was made in July 1911. Just to put this into context, because it's all very well talking about ladies' peels, 1911 was the year that the Titanic was launched from Harland and Wolff in Belfast. Obviously undertook its tragic journey a year later, but was actually launched in 1911. It was the year of the coronation, King George V and Queen Mary. Women were very much seen as the weaker sex. And it was a time of huge social change, with the Votes of Women campaigns and the suffragette movement very, very active. And a typical picture here of the sort of images that our ladies at the time, they may even have been some lady ringers there, who knows, in that picture on the right. This lady is Edith K. Parker, who some of you may have heard of. Most ladies' peels, or certainly a lot of the ones that I've researched, there was a driving force behind them, and this lady was certainly a driving force. The ringing world at the time, oops, let's just go backwards, sorry, going the wrong way, was seen as a lady of very firm character, determination, powers of leadership. And she saw clearly that if ladies were to achieve any standing in the exercise, they must first prove that they were equal to the menfolk in the tower. But the first task was to show that ladies could ring a peal without male assistance. So she assembled a band. What I should say is she was the daughter of James Parker, who was a well-known ringer, and he was tower captain at Edmonton in London. And he knew lots of other ringers across the country. So Edith assembled a band, or chose a band, chosen not only for their competence to ring grands or triples, which was the chosen method, but also as persons of temperament not likely to be perturbed by the importance of the occasion, nor by the knowledge that they were listened to outside by a band of expert critics. The lady on the right here is Alice White, and some of you may recognise her. She was actually the first lady to ring a tower bell peal in 1896. So the band was assembled, real logistics that we just wouldn't need to think about today. The band was assembled from across the country, which for us would be no problem. There were two ringers, Edith and Clara from Edmonton, Alice White, who I've just said, the first lady to ring a tower bell peal, a lady from Fleet in Hampshire, Eva Belcher, Mary Nightingale from Oxford, Lillian Wilson from Leicester, and Mary Jukes and Nellie Gillingham from Portishead. And what's interesting is that several of these ringers, certainly Lillian Wilson, Nellie Gillingham, were the daughters of well-known ringers. Again, just about the logistics, they got to get to London. That's where the peal was going to be. And as they were all young ladies, unmarried, and as such would have needed to be chaperoned. And in several cases, it was their fathers who chaperoned them, or their brothers. And also just how do you invite a band from across the country in 1911? You can't pick up the phone. That most places wouldn't have had that in those days. You'd have actually had to write a letter inviting these people in the peal, and they'd have had to reply back by letter. A number of challenges faced them. Sorry, just going to move my picture because it's blocking my screen. James Parker, Edith's father, wrote in the Ringing World leading up to this, "Here are girls brought 100 miles to strange bells and without practicing together. It's hardly to be expected, but give them a chance." One of the challenges was the distances they travelled. We've seen that they came from across the country. Many had to travel on various railways, and because of that, it was 4 o'clock when the band had all arrived on the scene of action. And that's quite late to be had a long journey, and then you're about to start ringing a peal at 4 o'clock. And there was, of course, some pre-peal faffing, which is good to note. Some photographs being taken, and a start was then made. However, there were some mechanical issues. There was a problem with the seventh, which was found that the wheel was rubbing on a shutter that had recently been put into the tower. Because of that, I'll come on to that in a minute, there were also the weather conditions. In 1911, there was a summer heat wave with record temperatures, and I don't think it was temperatures in the 30s, which I don't think were beaten until about the 1990s, I read. So we're talking about a very warm day in July. Those of you that have rung at Cubitt Town will know it's a fairly small, confined ringing chamber without very much ventilation there. And one of the band, not surprisingly given the heat, the conductor, or conductress as she was described as in 1911, was intending to ring the 7th, but because she didn't feel too well, she swapped and she rang the 5th. So we've got a conductor who's probably not the most experienced conductor. If she's anything like me, who doesn't conduct very much, I've sort of learned it from the bell I'm going to ring, and that would probably have thrown her. But the bells got into changes with a good swing, but alas, at the part end, they came into rounds, a bob being inadvertently omitted. So sadly, that attempt came to grief. However, not to be daunted, Edith assembled or rearranged the peal to take place almost exactly a year later in July 1912. And like in the previous year, they met at the various metropolitan railways and were invited by Mr. Hughes of Mears and Steenbank to the Bell Foundry in Whitechapel, where luncheon was served. And ultimately, the band found its way along Thameside to Cubitt Town. And I've put this picture here just to try and imagine the scene, because we, of course, would probably just jump on the tube. But in 1912, they could have, this photo was actually taken in 1912, They could have jumped on one of these buses, a hackney carriage, a horse and carriage, who knows quite how they got to Cubitt Town. And this is a photograph of the band. And this photograph, as I say, is the photograph that always mesmerised me when I went to ring at Cubitt Town as a student. Just the clothes that they're wearing, the long skirts, the long sleeves, probably corsets underneath that. And we've already said it was a very hot day. The band was essentially the same, 6 of the same ringers who were invited in 1911, who were in the first attempt. Alice White, unfortunately, and one of the other members of the band was indisposed. So Sarah Piggott from Smethwick in Birmingham and Evelyn Steele from Bedford rang instead. Evelyn Steele was probably the oldest in the band. She was 33 at the time. And many of my fellow Bedfordshire ringers remember Miss Steele, who was a formidable character and was not to be messed with. I think she's probably the lady at the back right-hand side of the photograph. Certainly looks quite formidable. So they made a start, having done photographs and a bit more faffing. But alas, trip after trip came along and a stand was called. The day grew warmer, the Belfry atmosphere denser, couldn't settle down. And after about 2 hours, Mrs. Whittington, whoever Mrs. Whittington was, who came down to listen, suggested, and here I throw my hands up in horror, tea. Now, of a lady of a certain age, okay, older than those ladies, drinking tea before a Peel attempt probably wouldn't be the best idea in the world. But anyway, they had their tea, which presumably maybe included a few sandwiches and cakes as well. They returned refreshed and determined on a final attempt and finally got away at 5:50 p.m. So we're talking quite late in the day. Would they get through? Again, this is from the Ringing World write-up afterwards. After all, however courageous a woman may be, she has not a man's stamina. So, bearing this in mind, with a view to preventing an accident, Mr. John Thomas volunteered to sit in the tower in case of emergency. Now, I don't know whether that was in case of emergency having drunk all the tea, or whether it was in case of emergency in case of one of the ladies feeling faint or bell handling or something like that. I probably suspect it's more likely to be in case they might faint or something like that. But the Peel was scored. John Thomas's assistance wasn't required. The Peel was scored in 3 hours and 4 minutes. And what I find remarkable about this, again, they're all young women. It was somebody's first Peel in the method. They're inexperienced. First Peel with a bob bell. It was Clara Beasley's, which I've missed off the little sign there. It was Clara Beasley's first Peel. Edith Parker, by far, was the most experienced, and probably Nellie Gillingham. And this Peel, the scoring of this Peel caused a huge stir, lots of reporting in the Ringing World, lots of congratulations, and ringers from across the country donated money for the Peel board to be hung on the right-hand side there, which still hangs in Cubitt Town today. Success is the reward of perseverance. And it certainly was a remarkable achievement, particularly when you put it into the context of the time. Also in that report in 1912 in the Ringing World, the quote is, "This is the first, but we feel, put my teeth in. We feel sure it will not be the last ladies' Peel." And of course, it wasn't. In one of my articles in the Ringing World before Christmas, I asked people to wonder, yes, how many there might have been. And before I started doing this research, I'd probably have put the number at 150, 200 maybe. And that's having rung in about 37 myself. But in fact, there have been 503 ladies' Peals run by all women's bands up until lockdown. Just looking at a graph there, the light blue are handbell peals, the dark blue tower bell peals. You can see there was a gradual rise from 1912 onwards until the First World War, another gradual rise, and then a really big surge in ladies' peals from the 1970s onwards, and particularly handbell peals as well. And we'll actually look at that graph again a bit later and look at the reasons for some of those figures that you see there. So leading on from 1912, the next couple of peals, I'm entitling here the Portishead Peals, the first of them was rung in January 1915. So that was the second ladies' peal, if you like. And what was remarkable about this, it was Grancer triples, again, rung by a band of ladies, which has been done before. But what's particularly remarkable about this is that all the women in the peal that you see pictured there, they were all ringers at Portishead near Bristol. They included Nellie Gillingham and Mary Jukes, who'd been in the 1912 peal, and all 8 of the ringers had been taught to ring by Mr. Gillingham, who was Nellie's father. Can you imagine how proud he would have been at that? Again, inexperienced, first peal for 3 of the band and 1 first peal with a bobbed bell. And the lady who called it, I call her a lady, she was just a girl, was Doris Coles, who was aged just 15, which was her first peal as conductor. I think she's the lady, the girl, in the bottom left-hand corner, but I could be wrong. A second peal was rung at Portishead in 1918, Grancer triples again, 7 of the local band, plus Edith Parker. Again, that connection with, well, with Edith and Nellie now, but also their fathers had rung together a lot of times. So the Portishead Peals, just to put those into context, the band were all young and married women, as I've already said. They were rung during the First World War. And so all of that band, being young women, would have had brothers, boyfriends, possibly even fathers, because the age of conscription was raised to 51, I think it was, in about 1918. I may have got those figures slightly wrong, but it could have been their fathers. They would have been away at the front. And so I'm sure they would have been part of scenes like this, saying goodbye to loved ones going off to the front. And it's partly, probably, because of that First World War and conscription, that there was a band of women. An editorial in the Ringing World at about the time said, in many parishes, the ladies have very gallantly come forward to fill the gaps in the belfry caused by the absence of men on war service. So there were towers, quite a few towers, that were being, where women were filling those gaps. Also putting it into context, the Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, which gave the vote to women over 30 who either owned property or were married to a property owner. And of course, all of our young and married women, even though they were probably over 18, still wouldn't have been able to vote at that point. So the next peal I'm going to talk about, and what I should say here is I'm really picking out what I call some of the either landmark peals or peals that have a bit of a story. And as I say, if you read The Ringing World, sorry, you've probably read about this already, but if not, it's still a really good story. And it involves a bet, chocolate, so that obviously raises my interest, romance, quite interesting too, and a rubber bus. So there is actually a poem that came to light when I was doing some research on this, that Rosemary Mason in Leicester had in her possession. I'll talk about that in a moment. And the poem begins, it was a lovely day in August on a hill near Simmons Yacht that 2 well-known ringers were strolling and having a friendly chat. One of the ringers is described as a fair maid, and she is Annie Parkins, who rang at the time at Woodthorpe in Peterborough. And the other, the male ringer, is Rupert Richardson from Surfleet, who apparently was the owner of a rubber bus. Now, my guess is that the rubber bus, it was called that because it had rubber tyres, which I think were quite a newfangled thing in 1922. And Rupert Richardson apparently was a market gardener, and so transported produce around all over the place, which is why he had a bus or a van or something. Anyway, as the poem goes on, now the subject was on ringing, and the lady said, I'll bet before the end of 22, a lady's peal will get. The busman said, that's wicked, so a lesson I will teach. I'll take a pound of bacca to a pound of chocolates each. So Annie Parkin took up the challenge and set about inviting a band. There were 2 people that she invited who weren't able to ring because they were going courting. Now, I have to say, if I was offered all that chocolate and I was supposed to be going courting, I'd have made an excuse. and gone and rang a peal. But anyway, that's me. The bus probably looked something like this. And Rupert Richardson travelled around. He went to Peterborough to pick up some of the band and one or two of the others on the way in his bus. So again, there's a report in the Ringing World and also the poem. It says that the ringing settled down and the bells pealed softly on. But then the listeners outside heard such a clatter, and they heard someone cuss. Now, I'm not quite sure what a cuss would sound like, but I'm sure in 1922, it was a very ladylike cuss. A bob had been missed out and the bells stood. So someone said, "Let's start again," said one. "I'm in a fix, for I've arranged to meet my boy at Desborough at 6. The other said, "That's done it. They really could have wept. They hung up all their bell ropes and out of church they crept." However, Rupert Richardson came to the rescue. Said he, "You must first have tea." It's tea again, but never mind, let's gloss over that. "Then start for the peal that's true. And if Ada can't go to Thomas, well, Thomas must come to you." So off went Rupert in his bus, tracked Thomas down, who was apparently playing cricket somewhere in Desborough, and brought him back to hear the end of the peal. And credit and congratulations they got. And though their hands were full of blisters, they did not care a jot. And of course, they would have had hands full of blisters. Those, in fact, we probably all will have hands full of blisters when we go back to peal ringing, as we haven't done it so long. But anyway. And so the peal was rung at Isham. And this story has a special meaning for me, really, because I learnt to ring at Barton Seagrave, which is just down the road. And Isham was actually the first other tower, new tower, that I rang at. Although little at the time did I know about this story. Again, a very inexperienced band, and the first peal in which the tenor was turned in. And they were all fairly local, although Peterborough's a bit of a drive, certainly in 1922. Now, I mentioned romance at the beginning, and I've already mentioned that 2 women couldn't ring to start with because they were courting. We've also heard about Ada going off to meet, or Thomas being brought to Ada, and also Annie Parkin and Rupert Richardson, who were having that stroll in Simmons Yacht, later married. Some of you who were at the 2003 12 bell final at Surfleet and who remember it, who didn't spend too much time in the beer tent, will remember that the beer tent was in the garden of a lady called Enid Wayman, a bungalow with a beautiful big garden, and she was the daughter of Annie Parkin and Rupert Richardson, and she presented the trophy to the winning team on the day. Phyllis Hare was another of the ringers, and she became Mrs. Phyllis Poole, who is the mother of Jill Poole, who became Jill Staniforth, very notable ringer in the Leicester area, and the grandmother of Rosie Mason, who's married to Kingsley Mason, who some of you will know, which is where I got the poem and the story and the photograph from. So Annie Parkin's on the left there and Phyllis Hare in the middle. And I just love that photo. The thought of them ringing in those wonderful 1920s costumes. And I did mention earlier about hats, and here obviously we have hats. There was a lot of debate about hats following the First World War, in fact. An editorial in July 1916 said in the Ringing World, "No one would think of a lady attending a service without a head covering. And as ringing is now recognised as being closely allied to the service, as at any rate the organ voluntary and the belfry as part of the church, it seems to be in accordance with the canons of decorum that ladies should wear a head covering." And the Ladies' Guild Minutes, 1923, the male chair suggested that some useful form of convenient uniform headgear might be chosen and adopted by members of the guild, as some found it difficult to ring in a hat. Now, obviously, what I don't know is whether these ladies did actually ring their peal in a hat. I think they were quite spirited ladies, and I have in my head a picture of them going into the church and shutting the door, taking their hats off, rolling their sleeves up, maybe giggling a bit that they were being so not in accordance with the canons of decorum, ringing the peal without the hat, and then popping outside again, wearing their hats, ready for the photograph with the 2 members of clergy there. but I don't know. That's just what I think might have happened. A few years later, we get the first peal on 10, which was rung at St Clement Danes in London, Stedman Caters in 1926. It was the first on 10 by a ladies' band, and it was the heaviest bell yet rung by a lady. And the report of this in the Ringing World in January 1926 says that in such a performance, interest will doubtless turn to the lady who has the pluck and physique to tackle the 24 hundredweight tenor, a heavier bell than any lady has previously rung to a peal. This was Miss Ruby Hawksworth, a robust brunette who is only 17 years of age. And when I read that, I picture all the lady tenor ringers that I know. In fact, there have been anniversary peals at Clement Danes in about 1976, 86, 96, I think. And I can just imagine the tenors ringers being described by their physique and their hair colour. But again, her age, 17, all very young women. 1928, the first peal of Major. And this is the band here, Plain Bob Major, rung at Handsworth in Sheffield. And this is the band here. One or two people that I'm going to talk about, because in the Ringing World report at the time, there was a little sort of who's who with snippets of, well, all of the band, in fact. So one of them, Hilda Jakes, she came from Mansfield Woodhouse and was the most experienced member of the band. She rang her first peal aged 12, again, really young. And in fact, she became the first lady to ring 2 peals in a day. So I'm just losing my place. And that's Hilda there. The interesting thing about Hilda is that she is actually, apart from what I've just said, she was the sister of Lillian Wilson, who was in the first ladies' peal at Cubitt Town. They were both the daughters of William Wilson, a noted ringer in Leicester at the time. Amy Taylor, who's standing next to her, of Worksop, was a bashful maiden with very little opportunities for peal ringing. But the fact that she rang the 7th bell in a major peal is a hallmark of ability. A badly struck 7th can spoil the best tenor ringer's efforts. Just trying to think of all the people I've rung 7ths, who ring 7ths. And it is on record that Miss Taylor struck her bell splendidly. And then we get Miss E. Fulk, Elizabeth Fulk from Duffield, who is one of the few tenoras in the exercise. And she's down there on the left-hand side. Her first essay, this is from the Ringing World, as a peal ringer, was on St. Valentine's Day, 1925. So romance obviously wasn't an issue with Elizabeth, which is good to note. I love this. Well, I don't know whether I love it or not, really. This quote is just wonderful. The choice of Miss Fulk for the tenor was a good one. Amongst the sterner sex, the ringer of that bell has a duty to shepherd the strollers when the colts run green. And it must be infinitely more difficult with a band of les filles. Again, I can imagine the faces of women tenor ringers of our day, our time, if they were written about like that. But of course, this is 1928. Language was different and attitudes as well were different. So the first handbell peal, up until now, all the peals have been on tower bells, all the ladies' peals, and they'd all been rung for the Ladies' Guild, sometimes in conjunction with another association. But in 1936, there were 2 handbell peals rung by sisters at Hinton on the Green. They were both members of the Johnson family. This was a family with 9 children, all of whom were taught to ring by their father, Frederick Johnson. This is a picture from the Ringing World in August 1912, and I'm just digressing slightly here, which is a picture of Frederick Johnson on the left, Joseph Johnson in the middle, and one of the other sisters, not one of the ones who was in the handbell peals, but just after they've rung, all 3 of them have rung their first handbell peal in 1912. Joseph was aged 13, his sister I think was a similar age. So again, real youngsters, and Joseph went on to be a very noted ringer, as did, well, several of his sisters, but particularly Amy Johnson, who conducted both of those handbell peals in 1936. And the amusing thing is, she only started handbell ringing. She learnt to ring at a similar sort of age when she was a child, and only took up handbell ringing because her brother, Joseph, told her she'd be no good at it. So, determined to prove him wrong, she started to learn handbells. And in fact, she became the first woman to ring 500 peals, and in total rang 663 peals, of which 302 were in hand. And 100 of those were rung with her husband, who lived in Enfield. They moved to Enfield in London. And this is the interesting bit. She married somebody called John Thomas, who was a bell hanger at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. And the ages probably work out, he could well have been the John Thomas who was in the ringing chamber at Cubitt Town in 1912 in case of accident. I don't know that for a fact, and I'd love to know, but I haven't managed to find out whether it was indeed the same John Thomas. I won't do my Scylla voice here, but this is the band who rang the very first peal of Surprise. The lady in the middle is Edith Parker. And this was in 1928, March 1928, in Crayford, Kent. And that's the band there. Edith Parker, by now, has married George Fletcher. So she's now Mrs. G.W. Fletcher. And one of the interesting things about finding out about these ladies' peelers, researching them, is so many are listed. Obviously, Mrs. F.I. Hares, Mrs. A.D. Barker, their maiden names, trying to link who is quite difficult. But as I say, that was rung, it was rung at the second attempt. So that's March 1928. So it's interesting as to whether if they'd scored it at the first attempt, that would in fact have been the first peal on 8, because it's only a couple of months after the peal of Bob Major at Handsworth. And there are a couple of further peals in 19th of Surprise Major, 1930, 1935, both conducted by Edith Fletcher, who, as I say, was a real force behind ladies' peals at that time. That the Success is the Ward of Perseverance banner on that very first peal board is again very relevant here. First peal of London Surprise Major. And this is the peal as written up in the peal book of Hilda Snowdon, who you can see there rang the tenor. Some of you will recognise the handwriting, because George Pipe actually wrote up Hilda Snowdon's peal books. So this is in George's very fine hand, and it was the first peal of London Major. Just looking at the ringers there, Hilda Snowdon is the third from the left. Lady second from the left is Edith Parker again. The two ladies on the right are Ivy Housden and Gwen Kippin. Now, some of you will know the Kippin family. Ivy Housden was, before she married, was Ivy Kippin. As I say, this really was perseverance. There'd been 7 previous attempts, extending over 6 or 7 years. Only 2 of the original band were in the first attempt, and that was Edith Fletcher and Emma Dicky Deal, who I think is the lady in the very smart grey suit in the middle. Now, Dicky Deal caused me a lot of problems, because when I was researching ladies' peals, Andrew Craddock gave me access to the database. But obviously, a lot of women took their husband's names. So and there was somebody listed in Peelbase as Dicky Deal. Her husband was actually called Richard Deal, who was also sometimes called Dicky. So the assumption was made that Dicky Deal was in fact Richard F. Deal. And it was only when I spoke to Chris Kippin that he said, no, that's Emma Deal. They called her Dicky. And so that was when we discovered this lady's peal, which otherwise had gone sort of untracked, because it looked as though there was a male in the band. Gwen Kippin and Ivy Housden, as I say, Charlie Kippin's sisters. Gwen Kippin, I'm not sure which one she is out of those 2 ladies in the front right-hand side, but she's still alive. She's 102, and she's probably the only surviving member now of these pre-war ladies' peals. So just to put all of this in context again, the Second World War was about to break out. By the outbreak of the Second World War, there'd been 23 ladies' peals, of which 19 were credited to the Ladies' Guild, sometimes with a local association, as I mentioned. The last peel before World War II was the first ladies' peel by the Cumberlands, the SRCY, who were to become a leading society in ladies' peels, as we'll see later on. Of those 23 peels, Edith Fletcher had conducted 13, 8 other women had shared in the remainder. But of course, the Second World War was to really change, a huge amount of social change for women and for ringing after the Second World War. So in World War II, during World War II, there were 3 handbell peals, ladies' handbell peals, 1 in Gloucester, 2 in Dorset. The first tower bell peal after World War II, and I hesitate to mention this to a Cambridge audience, but it was rung in November 1945, Granser Triples, by the OUS. And of course, actually, having a university, the Oxford University Society, ringing a women's peal, given that women weren't able to matriculate until 1920, and there was still a quota on women, is obviously quite interesting. What I should perhaps say is that in fact, the CUG didn't ring a ladies' peal until 1971. But moving swiftly on. Now, this obviously isn't the 1945 band, but I've put this here. This is a peal rung by the OUS in February 2020, and it was the first tower bell peal for the OUS since that peal in 1945. There had been some tower bell peals, sorry, some handbell peals in between, but not a tower bell peal. And that was quite noteworthy, and also very noteworthy. It was in fact the last ladies' peal to be rung before lockdown in March 2020. Post-war, there were quite a number of ladies' peals based around the Leicester area with sort of Leicester ringers and some of their contacts. This is from Jill Poole, who later became Jill Staniforth's peal book. And you can see Mrs. Dickie Deal was in it, and Edith Fletcher was still in it. So this is still that contact, that continuity from before the First World War, ringing lady peals. Phyllis Poole, who was in the Isham peal, rang the third, and Hilda Snowdon rang the tenor. And she rang a lot of tenors in this period, a very noted and very good tenor ringer. And one of her claims to fame, one of the things she was very proud of, was that she never ever turned a tenor in. Sorry, wrong. She always turned the tenors in. She never ever rang a tenor behind. And she rang some pretty hefty bells as well. So, and she'll appear again, in fact, here. So this is the first peal of Royal, which was rung at St John the Divine, Leicester, which is of course no longer there, in May 1961. And the band from left to right, this is being greeted afterwards by the vicar. And again, this was immediately after the peal, so they've all got their nice dresses on. So different from the way we would dress today. And some of you may recognise some of these ladies. As I say, Jill Staniforth, a very well-known ringer. Sheila Collins, Sheila Melville behind her. Joan Beresford, who became Joan Summerhays. And Hilda Snowdon on the right-hand side, who was a tenor ringer. And Kathleen Locke, some of you might have heard of Tom Locke, who rang in Bushy, and she was his wife. And this is just the report of that peal. Peal of Stedman's, oh no, sorry, this is the next peal. First on 12, Stedman Sinks, again by a sort of Leicester-based band in Leicester, some of the same, quite a few of the same ringers. Hilda this time turning in the tenor, and Doris Colgate from Kent, I'm just looking at John, ringing the tenor behind, and conducted by Joan Beresford. And what was quite interesting, we've got Dickie Deal in this, who's now, I would say getting on a bit, but she is by now a grandmother, and she rang in the first 10-bell peal, Stedman Caters at Clement Danes, 1926, and now she's ringing in the first 12-bell peal as well, in 1964. The first of Maximus was rung in Bristol in 1975, And you can see the band here. And again, some of you will recognise some of the people in that peal. Heather Kippin being one, Kath Furman looking very young, right in the middle at the back, and Hilary Muirhead, who was a Cambridge University graduate, and she in fact conducted the first peal for the Cambridge University Guild in 1971. First Ladies Peal, sorry, yeah, First Ladies Peal. Margaret Chapman, Jenny Taylor, so some well-known names there. In terms of peals of Maximus, out of that 503 peals that have been rung by ladies' bands, there have been 23 peals of Maximus, of which 22 have been a surprise and one of Plain Bob Maximus. So a very impressive achievement. As I said, there were a lot of ladies, there were quite a strong ladies' band in Bristol at the time. And Heather Kippin related to me that she felt the reason for this was probably the arrival in Bristol of Hilary Muirhead, just graduated from Cambridge, who was a very competent conductor. And they got a couple of very good tenoringers as well, or back-enders, Cecil Colburn and Vivian Rigby. And most of these peals that you see there, some of them are asterisked because they were the first Leicester Prize Major, first Cambridge Maximus that we've just seen, and the first London Surprise Royal. Although it was a Cumberland peal, it was very much a Bristol-based band. She said they were sort of plotted really in the pub after ringing. And one of the reasons they rang them was because it was a really good excuse to leave. Most of them had young families, and it was a good excuse to leave the men looking at the husbands, looking after the children, and the ladies went off and rang a peal and had a fun girls' night out. And I think that's probably the motivation for some of the peals which have been run more recently too. And I put this one in because another peal of Cambridge Surprise Maximus, rung by the UBSCR, the Bristol University Society. So to actually have a band in 1993, a university band, able to ring a peal of Cambridge Maximus is quite an achievement. So just looking back again at that graph, we've seen a gradual rise up to 1969 and then gradually 1970s, a bit of a jump, including a lot of handbell peals. And I don't know whether Marge is with us tonight, but a lot of those handbell peals were down to Marge and her colleagues in Washington and later at Smith College. So Marjorie Winter, who was then, of course, Marjorie Batchelor, is actually the joint leading conductor of Ladies' Peals with Christine Hill. And she was at Washington Girls' School, which, of course, being a girls' school, they were taught to ring at the cathedral by Rick Dirksen. I've got a feeling Quilla might be on the call, this call, and will know far more of this, so I apologise if I've got any of this wrong. They formed the Whitechapel Guild, had several trips to England to do some ringing, but also rang handbells. And Marge said she started conducting at the same time she started ringing handbells, and has a memory of liberating the handbells, the school handbells, from the music room and disappearing into the changing rooms where nobody in their right mind would look for anyone at lunchtime. She says that as she was the shoutiest person around at the time, who could usually remember the coursing order and put people right, she did a lot of the conducting. And of course, then when she went to Smith College, there were other ladies there, Becky Joyce, Alice Parker, Martha Locke, and they rang handbells every lunchtime, getting as far as Yorkshire Major. And so that's one of the reasons why you've got that big burst of handbell peals. And apparently they hadn't actually got their own set of handbells. And Bill Theobald saw that they were missing a set, knew that this would be helpful, and found a set hanging up for decoration in a pub somewhere in the East End of London, got them, had them done up the foundry for £25, and those bells are still used by the North American Guild. Now, at the beginning, I promised you hats and bikinis. Well, we've had the hats, here are the bikinis. This was a peal rung in August 1997, 79, sorry, can't read. Plain Bob Minor rung for the W&P, Winchester and Portsmouth Guild, at Walton Hill in Hampshire. And it was rung in bikinis to celebrate summer 1979 that never was. Some of you might know Anne Bennett on the treble, who is now Anne La Marichal. Helen Piper still rings quite a few peals. Christine Joyce gave me this photo. She's now Christine Saunders and still rings. And she said the choice of tower was really crucial. They had to, I've lost what she said now. They basically needed somewhere light, easy to ring bells, where we could lock ourselves in with no risk of anyone seeing us. Christine took the photo with the camera timer. It was taken inside the ringing chamber because we didn't want to be seen outside in bikinis. And I love the pile of clothes on the right-hand side there. Might be a couple of bras there, I can't really see. The Peel, they were going to follow the Peel by another one wearing corsets and no stays. They knew they could remove the stays at North Stoneham, which would have been a suitable tower, but they didn't have 6 corsets. So the Peel never did take place, which is a great shame. Now, I've put this here really to put into context the next Peel. Some of you will recognise here Greenham Common Peace Camp, which in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a huge protest there over many, many months, if not years, a women's peace camp protesting against the sighting of nuclear missiles at Greenham Common at the US Air Base there. Note particularly the caravan in the bottom right-hand corner. And although this wasn't a particularly significant Peel in the context of being a landmark Peel, there's just a really good story attached to it, which is why I'm going to tell you it. So 4 of us, I was Linda M. Cox at the time, my great friend Alison Surrey, who became Alison Regan, Gwen Rogers, who was Master of the Cumberlands at the time, and Ros Rawlings, decided we would go off to Greenham Common to ring a handbell peal. And when we got there, the women were really perturbed because the bailiffs were about to arrive and tow away their caravan. Don't know whether it was the exact caravan in that previous photo, but it was certainly one that looked very, very similar. And that contained all their dry provisions. And my car, which I'd driven down there with everybody, happened to have a tow bar. So they said, would you just mind driving around the base a few times with the caravan and then come back when the bailiffs have gone? Which I duly did, which was probably completely illegal, but let's not worry about that. And so we got back. I think we probably had a bit of lunch or something. And then we set about ringing our handbell peal, watched by the ladies. I think this was, I remember sitting on logs under the trees and it was very wet. So I think this was probably just posing for a photograph. But anyway, so we did a bit of chatting, did a bit of protesting like you do. And then we went to go home and obviously needed to unhitch the caravan. So with the help of the Greenham women, we decided or discovered we couldn't get rid of the caravan, couldn't unhitch it. So we pulled levers, we jumped up and down on the tow bar, we shook the car up and down, we wiggled the caravan, you don't wiggle a caravan, you push the caravan, but we could not unhitch it. So Gwen then had a brainwave, this is pre-mobile phones obviously, and she remembered seeing a telephone box at the end of the track that led up to the woods. So she was a member of the RAC, she went down, phoned the RAC, eventually a fairly disgruntled RAC man came, lifted the caravan off by pulling one lever with one finger and got back into his car muttering something about bloody women, and off he went. What I should also say is that the peal was originally rung for the Cumberlands, of which Gwen was master, but the Cumberlands wouldn't accept it. There was a heated debate at the AGM and it was thrown out and eventually we rang it for the UL. So we move on to the 1980s and the 1990s, as you see, there was a lot of peals rung there, and some would describe it as a golden era. Just putting it into context, all those early peals were rung during the time of votes for women, women's rights. 1970s and 1980s, I'm not an expert, and although I went to Greenham Common, I can't claim to be a real feminist.
Not on that day, anyway.
It was equal rights and social rights. Feminism based on looking at equal rights and social rights and an opportunity to demonstrate equality. And a lot of the ladies' peals in that time, I think the thing that started off that wave of ladies' peals was this lady who some of you again will know is Stephanie Pattenden. And she was elected in 1982 as the first woman master of the Cumberlands. And Steph is a wonderful back-end ringer. a wonderful mentor and wonderfully encouraging. And I remember going to practices during that time, and she was the first master that gave me opportunities to ring a little bit round the back and conduct things, and all the other women that went along to practices at that time. And Stephanie herself says that in the 1980s, women ringers were somewhat typecast. Band placings were very traditional, with women round the front. And I remember a Peel band I used to ring regularly with having to really fight to get put on the 6th at an 8-bell tower and make myself a nuisance or argue my case. We did feel a need to demonstrate equality and prove ourselves. And there was also a challenge to meet. There were still some firsts to be rung. Obviously, leading up to the 1960s, there'd been Peals on 12, there'd been Surprise Royal, there'd been Surprise Maximus, but there were still lots of firsts to be rung. Maggie Whiteley, who was a member of the band that rang a lot of Peals during the 80s and 90s, said that she was very privileged to be ringing at that time. Rang some excellent Peals, delightful company and professionalism. And I feel very privileged too, because I will make an apology now that I'm afraid there's quite a few pictures of me coming up, because A, they're the photos I had, and B, I was very lucky to ring in some of these really landmark Peals in the 1980s and 1990s. So these sort of landmarks fell really into 3 categories. There were long lengths, all of which were rung for the Cumberlands. The first one was rung in 1980, and it was really the idea of Martin Whiteley, who'd rung lots of long lengths, or several long lengths, and suggested to his wife Maggie, why don't the women do them? And I think this is a pattern throughout a number of these Peals, landmark Peals, that it was the menfolk, the husbands, the boyfriends, the partners, who made suggestions. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And in fact, Jake, sitting next to me here on the right, actually umpired that Peel at Hungerford. So 1982 in Lydney and 1984, Yorkshire Maximus at Kingston upon Thames. And all of those were set up to be record Peals. So that was, at the time, the record Peel of Maximus. And there's the band there, some very young, some of whom you might recognise. I was going to say a very young George Unsworth, but you can't see her because she's hiding at the back. But other people there that you might recognise. And very blessed with very, very good backenders there, with Alison, Stephanie, Geraldine, and others as well. The first Peel of Splice Surprise Maximus was again rung for the Cumberlands, 1983. Again, this was Stephanie's doing, really, and it was ladies from sort of London practice night with a few other people. Leslie was in it. I don't know whether Leslie is watching tonight. Leslie, obviously an excellent backender, ringing down the back there. So that was in 1983. And I remember at the time feeling that we'd rung a really landmark Peel, really. It was a really, really good achievement. There were then the big Peals by that I mean Peals of bells with tenors of over 40 hundredweight. Again, these in those days were all rung for the Cumberlands. The first one, 1984, at Redcliffe, Bristol, which Maggie Whiteley rang the tenor to. St Mary Le Bow, Stedman Sinks, in 1988. And you can see there on the top right, that was the band. A couple of Cambridge ringers were in it. Liz Ormes there, who you might recognise. Stephanie Kenton is what I was going to say. So we've got Leslie, Liz, and myself, sort of Cambridge linked there. And I remember that being a really tough Peel, because they're not an easy ring of bells. And Alison rang the tenor. We then went on to ring in 1991 York Minster. And that came about really just a conversation between some boys in the pub. Well, the ladies really ought to ring York Minster now. Well, if they can come and ring a quarter, they can come. If they can ring a quarter, then I'll let them have the bells for a Peel. So a quarter Peel was duly rung in the late 80s, I think. It might have been even in 88. And we then went on to ring a Peel in 1991 with Alison and Julia, both ringing the tenor. Again, Stephanie on the 11th. And again, another Peel, Mary Le Bow of Cambridge Maximus. Inverary, okay, another big Peel. This wasn't a Cumberland Peel, but is obviously a real achievement, and there's also a really good story attached to it. February 1997, there was a Peel of Plain Bob Caters rung, 3 hours 50 minutes, it was rung for the Scottish Association, but in fact half the band were Newcastle and Durham ladies, and they used to have ladies' days out, and the reason for that was really just because, as I said earlier, there were several Peel conductors, all male, in the area, very typecast in their band placings, very typecast in the bands they invited. So the ladies organised themselves, had days out, and practiced conducting, ringing tenors and ringing Peals. And in fact, I mentioned earlier a Peel of Plain Bob Maximus, that was rung in fact by several of this band for the Durham and Newcastle as a result of those days out. And they said it was really just to sort of build their confidence and give them opportunities that they wouldn't already have had. The story attached to this, again, a real achievement. Rachel Dyson, who's in the back row on the right, rang the tenor, and Jess Davis, who's next to her in the back row, rang the ninth. Jess apparently fueled the Peel with black pudding. She had everybody, the rest of the band's black pudding for breakfast. I'm not sure how good a strategy that might be. And Rachel, at the end of it, was absolutely whacked, as you can imagine. She was sharing a room with Christine Richardson, who's in the front left-hand side, and went to the loo, obviously bursting for the loo after the Peel. So they went back to the hotel over the road. Rachel went to the loo and then got stuck on the loo because her legs seized up. So Christine Richardson, bless her, had to pull her off the loo. Inverary also rung to a Peel of Royal. Julia Cater rang the tenor in 2000. One of the heavies that eluded that 1980s band was Exeter Cathedral. And this is another story of perseverance. So this is the band that rang a Peel at Exeter in 2008. George was in it, as you can see there, and myself and other people, again, that you will recognise. But this was a culmination of a number of attempts. First one was in April 1994. So some members of the band that eventually rang it, including, oops, hang on, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Let me just go back. There we go. Mary Holden, for example, who rang the 8th, probably hadn't even learnt to ring in 1994. But we rang for about 2 hours in 1994, and a bit of a hesitation on the front, probably the first hesitation of the Peel, and it went into a big heap, as Stedman tends to do. So it was rearranged for 1995, similar band, but there was a miscall, as again, there can be in Stedman, but we did discover several years later that actually the composition would have been false had we rung it. So that in some ways might have been a lucky escape. And then members of the band started families, we all got a bit older, we'd still have the occasional conversation, we all really ought to go for that Peel at Exeter again. Howard Eggleston, who was tower captain of Exeter at the time, ringing master, was really, really supportive, kept reminding me that, you know, it was the deadline for booking Peals, encouraging me to write. And eventually we did, and booked a Peel for September 2007. So a number of years had passed. So we were about to go for this Peel in September 2007, but there was work on the tower that overran, so it had to be cancelled. And again, this was probably quite fortuitous because Julia had been really worried about how to tell me we were going to be a tenor in a short. She was pregnant and had been very worried as to how she was going to break this news. So it was rearranged for 2008, by which time Julia had Paisley or Bethany, whichever one it was, Paisley. So we're talking 14 years after the first attempt. About half the original band in that. Few full starts, a full start of a few sixes because I think we were all so nervous. And then we scored it. And George at the end of it said, "Thanks, girls. It was a blast," which it was. There have been Peals rung at a number of other heavy towers. I'll just go whiz through these very quickly. You can see them there. Worcester is worth mentioning. Claire Woolston rang the tenor. complaining all the way through it wasn't going very well, and discovered afterwards that the gudgeon had gone on the tenor. So how she rang that, I don't know. Queen's Tower, obviously not one of the easiest, well, one of the most difficult places to ring a peal. And it's the one peal where Alison Regan, as now is, had the grace to at least be taken off her feet a couple of times and look slightly pink in the face. Most other huge bells that she's rung, she's just done it without showing any sweat whatsoever. And she, of course, rang St Buryan tenor in Cambridge, to Cambridge Minor. Again, a great achievement. And of course, I've missed out another real biggie and another real achievement. Stedman Sinks at St Paul's Cathedral on the day of the Women's Marathon. Standing outside, all those crowds, the noise that there must have been, that you must have been able to hear in the ringing chamber. That's a really fantastic achievement. And very fittingly, very sadly, Alison, who I've mentioned a few times, my great friend, was due to ring in this peal. She was due to ring the 11th, but sadly died less than a month before. So the real peal was rung in her memory. And then there's hard peals, and I've listed a few here. First peal of Bristol by a ladies' band in 1980. Evesham, Avon, which is pretty spiky, and the fact that it was rung Evesham with a 3600 weight tenor is quite impressive. Silent Bristol Maximus, just to prove that ladies can remain silent for over 3 hours. Orion, and a couple of hairy peals of Spliced. And the thing about all of these peals is that, in fact, I think all ladies' peals, they're always a real team effort, often inexperienced conductors, and that was certainly the case with these peals here, and often people ringing things for the first time. So team effort and that 110% effort to keep right. Another silent peal was rung by the Cumberlands in 1999, and this was a peal of Splice Surprise Royal, and was another peal, I think, where Perseverance won the day. Ringing Mod of 1999, there's a report on the peal, and it says that for some of the band, the project had started about 9 years ago and had haunted us ever since. I can't remember how many attempts we had, but it was certainly over a very long period of time. And not only did we manage to remain silent, which some of our group is, some of whom may be sitting to my right, may have mentioned, we rang a really, really good peal. The footnote to the peal, or the report, thanked a certain number of male ringers who, as we say here, unwittingly helped make the composition more memorable. My main memory of this peal was that several of us had very, very rude mnemonics for some of the courses, which I won't repeat here because we're in polite company. And the trouble was, some of us knew each other's very rude mnemonics. And so when we got to those courses, we just had to sort of look at the ground and not look at each other. Otherwise, we'd have dissolved into giggles and lost the peal. A number of ladies over the years, as we have rung now 1,000 peals, including the lady in the middle, who is Muriel Rie from Birmingham. So in 2007, a band of 1,000 lady pealers rang a peal at Worcester All Saints, Cambridge Maximus, to mark her the 30th anniversary of her 1,000th peal, which was a real milestone at the time, rung at Birmingham Cathedral. And Margaret Edwards, who, again, some of you may know, who is noted for talking a lot, had persuaded Muriel to go out for the day. I think Margaret took her out for the day quite a lot, just to hear some ringing, didn't let on what the occasion was. So when the peal had finished and we all descended the tower and she found out why the peal had been rung, she was absolutely delighted. And then we went and had a really good session in the pub afterwards. Peals of Surprise Major, just a quick breakdown there of Peals of Surprise Major, the number of peals in that second column in each method. When the first peal was rung, where and who for. So Cambridge, that first peal in 1928, and the superlative in London we've already talked about. Yorkshire was the first peal of Surprise Major. Sorry, not the first peal of Surprise Major. The first peal of Yorkshire was in 1953 by that Leicester band that we mentioned earlier. And there have been 62 of those. So that's the most rung method for any ladies' peel. There was also a Peel of Yorkshire, silent and non-conducted, in 1977, which was the first silent and non-conducted peel. And various other ones there, Lincolnshire, Rutland. And actually, just looking back at the London, that first peel at Harlow Common that we looked at earlier, in fact, the only other peel of London rung by a ladies' band was at St Andrews, Cambridge, for the Ely Guild, which some of you may even have been in. You may have noticed there's a method missing out of the Standard 8 there, and that's Pudsey. There's never been a ladies' peel of Pudsey Surprise Major. So there's a little project for somebody, for us, once we're allowed to ring peels again. And a number of peels of Splice Surprise Major have been rung. Again, I've just listed those and we'll just leave that there just for a moment. But what's quite interesting about that, quite a number of conductors who are not necessarily regular conductors, even Kath Mullane, who's conducted quite a number of ladies' peels, she doesn't ring very much at all now, but some fairly inexperienced conductors. So again, everybody having to stay right and stick to the line. Another hard peel that was rung, 23 All the Work, which was very much George's initiative, I think. And she arranged that. That was rung in Huntingdon, York. It was a Cumberland country meeting. We heard a rumour, and I still don't know whether the rumour was true, that the college youths ladies were going to ring a peal of Chandlers. So George got together a band. That weekend there happened to be some of the Northern ladies and some London Cumberlands, all of whom had rung one peal of Chandlers, were going to be up at the country meeting in Newcastle. And so we had two attempts, one on the Saturday, which we lost, but then had a big practice ringing the last 5 parts, and then rang it on the Sunday, which was, I think that was one of the loudest whoops I've ever heard in a ringing room. Splice Surprise Minor, these are coming on to much more recent peels, and this was rung in 2019. But I should mention here an Ely band, people like Edith and Marion Robinson, Sue Binns, Vanessa Webster, Janet Garnett, Sue Marsden, and other Ely ladies who built up, rang several ladies' peels of Splice Surprise Minor, reaching up to 20 Surprise Minor in May 2015, which was the most, I think, until this was rung. And Edith told me, again, it wasn't necessarily organised as ladies' peels, but just it was to give them confidence and a secure environment and a comfortable environment to ring the peels. And obviously what's quite sad about this peel, Sue Marshall on the right-hand side died later that year, which was very sad. And the penultimate peel before lockdown was Splice Trouble Dodging Minor, 147 methods, which I'm obviously not going to list because that would have taken up a whole screen. Again, a very impressive achievement. And finally, another noteworthy peel that I know the people who rang in it were very proud of, a mother and daughter's peel. So Ali and Imogen and Rosemary from Cambridge in that, Christine Hill, who was a Cambridge graduate, and her 2 daughters, Rosemary and Catherine, also in that. That was run at Reading in 2012. So at the end of that first ladies' peel, this is the first, but we feel sure it will not be the last ladies' peel, and of course it wasn't. But what would those ladies, those austere-looking ladies, have thought? In fact, there's been 503 ladies' peels. I've just gone through a few of those, obviously, and really the landmark peels, but there have been lots and lots of other ladies' peels, less flash maybe, but real achievements and worthy of note for the people that rang in them. Just a couple of peels that I'm just going to put up there. A couple of Ladies Guild peels at Grunsborough and at Sherfield English in Hampshire. They've been rung for 60 different guilds and associations. Ladies Guild and the Cumberlands have rung the most, Ladies Peels the most, closely followed by the Cumberlands. 1,309 ringers. 208 different conductors. And what I find most impressive is that for at least 58 of those, it was their first as conductor. And when you go through the list of ladies' peals or look at all of them, there's so many firsts. So is there a place for ladies' peals in the 21st century? I did a survey of a number of ladies who'd run quite a lot of ladies' peals and asked them this question. And what they came up with was yes, for occasions, anniversaries, things like anniversaries, the ordination of women, and name peals. So there's a couple of anniversary peals here for 100th anniversary of the first peel run by a lady, which, surprise, surprise, was Edith Parker, and a peel to mark the 100th anniversary of the first lady's peel, which was also in memory of Alison Regan. And there were quite a few peals rung at the time to mark that 100th anniversary. And then there have been some name peals. There have been a couple of peals rung by a band of Annes, a band of Elizabeths, and a band of Susans. And I understand that the first attempt for Susan Peel, David Brown made a guest appearance, because obviously somebody didn't turn up. A lot of people commented it was a really good night out, good girls' night out, and I've mentioned that already. Sometimes it's to fulfill, somebody will arrange a ladies' peel to fulfill a personal ambition, a chance to ring a bit bigger bell or conduct, and with people that they feel are supportive and encouraging, not intimidating. One person who I won't mention mentioned there's much less willy waving. Now I know that doesn't apply to all men ringers, including the person to my right, but certainly a lot of women have felt it was a less stressful atmosphere. And there's a challenge and a greater sense of achievement and a team effort. So although there is a mixed view, is there a place? Personally, in my view, I think there is. And I'm going to stop there and just pop that up there because I've mentioned Alison a lot. She was a huge friend of mine and a real inspiration to so many, not only women ringers, but other ringers too. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was absolutely fantastic.
Shall I stop sharing?
No, it's okay. I'm happy if you're happy. There we go. Yeah, there's a couple of questions in. So please do enter any questions you've got into the Q&A interface. But that was a fantastic tour through ladies' peels over the last.
Sorry, I've been a bit more than an hour, but never mind.
Yeah, it's all right. Don't worry. So the questions that we've had in are. Let's go the last one first because it relates to what you've just been talking about. Why have there been so few ladies name peels?
I guess, well, okay, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, certainly I thought about a Linda Peel, but I didn't know enough Lindas. And it's just that there haven't been obvious, there were a lot of Cumberland, there were lots of Annes in the Cumberlands in the 70s and 80s. So that was an obvious one. I know Sue organised the Susan Peel, but I don't know is the answer. Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I think yes. Presumably, you can sort of start drawing the circle slightly wider. I
think it's who knows who, and do you happen to know enough women with the same name as you, and do you fancy organising a peel?
Yeah.
I mean, Catherine would be a good one. There's probably lots of Catherines, but there aren't huge numbers of Lindas, sadly. And the one I do know, Linda Woodford, when I was thinking about it at the time, is obviously in the States, so there might be a few.
Oh. And then question: why was the? I
can see it.
There we go. Why was the peel at Green and Common rejected by the Cumberlands?
Because quite a lot of the older gentlemen in the Cumberlands objected. Well, it was just gentlemen. Objected to it, felt it was too political. Because I mean, Green and Common and the whole thing at the time was a big thing in the news at the time, and it was frowned upon by some, shall we say, and it was just felt to be too political, and we shouldn't ring peels for political reasons. And it was voted upon, and thrown out, which was a bit embarrassing for Gwen because she was in the chair at the time as Master of the Cumberlands. It was quite a shock, actually. I mean, we were just gobsmacked, but there we go.
Yeah.
I remember a very, very heated discussion at the AGM in January the following year. Several letters being written.
Yeah, I know.
Oh yeah, actually, no, it wasn't just men. Actually, no, it wasn't just men. I'm being reminded by the person on my right here. Let's just stop sharing my screen and then he can join in. There we go.
Hello.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, and anyway, I'm very glad that you didn't reference my Blatant Discrimination Act earlier.
Oh yes, the lack of the yes, I have noted it in my notes here that Dave Richards, I didn't get the jazzy intro in the same way that John Lovelace got when he did his talk, which is blatantly discrimination.
Well, it is, for which I apologise. But yes. If I could make up for it by ringing in a lady's name Peel, I would. But obviously, that's
Davina.
Davina.
Yeah. We've got a Davina in Bedfordshire, so there's two of you.
Anyway, I don't think there's any more questions. But anyway, that was absolutely fantastic, and like I say, and some of the images I thought really, really, really excellent. Really.
The early ones are just brilliant.
Yeah. So thank you so much for researching all of that and pulling all of that together for us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so all that's left for me to say thank you very much again to Linda, and also thanks to John as well for his talk.
He was whispering in my ear now and again if I missed something out.
It was me who got her to stop.
And he was sort of saying, like,
wonderful. And then yeah, and just to say to everyone, hope you're able to tune in 2 weeks' time for Tom Ridgman to talk about horrible histories. And just remains for us to say good night. So would you like to say good night?
Good night. Good night. Thank you, and thank you very much indeed for listening.
Brilliant, wonderful, and good night, everyone.